The dress was supposed to feel like rebellion. It felt like standing naked in a room full of wolves. I'd bought it 3 weeks after Marco made it clear that loving him was a liability I couldn't afford. The red was less about confidence and more about spite. The kind of spite that tastes like ash in your mouth while you're smiling. My best friend Elena had squeezed my hand in the boutique and said, "You look alive." And I'd decided that was close enough to happy. The gala at the Bellini Hotel wasn't supposed to be complicated. Elena's new boyfriend's firm was sponsoring it, some charity thing for children's hospitals. The kind of event where wealthy people performed goodness for tax purposes. I was there because she'd begged me, because spending Saturday night alone in my apartment meant thinking about Marco's hands on my shoulders, his mouth against my temple, his voice in the dark saying things I'd convinced myself I'd misunderstood. The dress was red, silk and dangerous, and cut in a way that made my ribs feel too tight, or maybe that was just my lungs forgetting their job when I walked into the ballroom. The ceiling was all glass and chandelier crystals, throwing fractured light across the crowd. I could see myself reflected 1,000 times a girl in red. A girl trying, a girl who was about to make a mistake she wouldn't understand until it was already written across someone else's face. "You look incredible," Elena said, pulling me toward the bar. Her boyfriend Marcus was already networking, doing whatever men in suits do when they want to seem important. She was dressed in midnight blue, elegant and safe. "See, you're already better. You're out, you're living, you're not thinking about him?" I finished, but my voice had that edge that meant I was doing exactly that. Exactly. But I was thinking about him. The problem with Marco wasn't that he was dangerous. Danger, at least, is honest. You see it coming. It has the courtesy of teeth and sharp edges. The problem with Marco was that he'd made danger feel like home. He'd taken me into rooms where impossible things happen to people who ask the wrong questions. And he positioned himself between me and all of it like some beautiful, terrible wall. And then he'd walked away because loving him meant I'd eventually become a target, and Marco Russo didn't keep targets he couldn't protect by distance alone. "I'm going to get a drink," I said to Elena. What I meant was, I need space because the weight of pretending is making my chest tight. The bar was crowded. Of course it was. I had to wait, squeezed between a woman with sharp elbows and a man who smelled like cologne and entitlement. The bartender had kind eyes. I ordered something with vodka and lime because I wasn't thinking clearly enough to order something else. The crowd shifted. I felt it before I saw him, that specific gravity, that displacement of air that meant something immovable had entered the room. It was the same feeling I'd gotten every single time Marco had walked through a door while we were together. That primitive knowledge that the temperature had changed, that the oxygen had been reorganized into a new configuration. I didn't turn around. I was aware of every single inch of my body suddenly. The slope of my shoulders, the way the red silk caught the light, the vulnerable curve of my back where the dress dipped below my shoulder blades. I'd felt beautiful in this dress for 45 minutes. Now I felt exposed. The bartender handed me my drink. "Excuse me." His voice, not even directed at me, but close enough that it vibrated through my spine. He was ordering something, speaking to the bartender in that low, controlled tone that made people move faster and apologize for existing. The bartender practically genuflected. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked directly back to Elena and pretended I'd never felt that voice, never recognized the specific configuration of danger and silk that came with it. Instead, I stood there, the vodka and lime untouched in my hand, trying to convince my shoulders to stop communicating the fact that I was terrified. "You're here." He was speaking to me now. I could feel the precision of his gaze, the way it moved across my back, cataloging the red dress, the way I was holding myself, the fact that I absolutely could not turn around without my hands shaking. I turned around anyway. Marco Russo at 34 was a study in controlled lethality. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, his cars, actually, plural, stored in a garage in a part of the city I wasn't supposed to know about. His dark hair was perfectly ordered, his jaw clean-shaven, his expression the kind of calm that made powerful men nervous. But his eyes were what caught me every single time, black as obsidian and looking at me like I'd just done something both catastrophic and necessary. "I didn't know you'd be here," I said. Which wasn't true. Some part of me had known. Some part of me had worn this dress specifically hoping he would be. "You did," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was the quiet of dominance, not softness. "You looked like you were daring someone to notice you. That's not why I stopped. The lie felt too fragile. "I'm not here because of you." "No, you're here despite me." He moved closer and the crowd seemed to understand it needed to make space. "Which is stupid, Bella, and dangerous." The word fell between us like something with weight. Bella. Beautiful. Not the casual kind of beautiful. The kind he used when his hands were steady and he was about to do something irrevocable. "I'm allowed to go to parties," I said. My voice sounded small. "I'm allowed to have a life that doesn't involve you." "You are." He paused. His gaze moved across my face, cataloging, assessing. "The dress, though? The dress is a conversation we need to have. It's just a dress, Marco." "No." He shook his head slightly. "It's you in red, in a room full of people I haven't assessed for threats. It's you looking like you want to be noticed. It's you making it impossible for anyone else to see anything but you." My hand was shaking. I gripped the glass tighter. "That's not my problem." Something flickered across his face, anger maybe, or possessiveness, or something darker that I didn't have a name for. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, and it carried the weight of a decision already made. "Come with me." "No, not a request, Kara." He moved his hand and I understood with sudden clarity that he was about to touch me, going to place his palm on the small of my back, going to guide me out of this ballroom and into somewhere private, where the rules were different and he made all the decisions. And I was about to let him, because my body had apparently never gotten the memo that my heart was supposed to have moved on. Elena appeared, suddenly, her hand on my arm. "Sarah, I need you for a second." She was looking at Marco with something like fear, which meant she'd recognized what he was, what his presence meant. "We were supposed to take a photo for the in a moment," Marco said to her, but his eyes stayed on me. "Miss Chen, isn't it? Your boyfriend is doing well in acquisitions. It would be unfortunate if that changed." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was the shape of a threat, the shadow of one. Elena's grip on my arm tightened. "We're going," she said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised me. "Sarah needs to freshen up." Marco looked at me. There was something in his expression that I would spend the next 3 weeks trying not to understand, something that looked like a man watching his own control shatter into pieces and deciding whether to gather them back up or let them fall. "The dress," he said quietly. "You shouldn't wear red, Bella. It makes you visible. It makes you mine whether you want to be or not." Elena was already pulling me away, and I let her. Because my legs didn't feel entirely under my command. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, on the exposed curve of my shoulders, on the red silk that had suddenly become the most dangerous thing I'd ever owned. I didn't look back, but when I got to the bathroom, I locked the door and stared at myself in the mirror, at the girl in red, at the reflection of someone who'd been lying to herself for 3 weeks about whether she'd ever moved on at all. The red dress had been a mistake, or it had been the most honest thing I'd ever done. 3 days later, my apartment was small enough to feel claustrophobic even when it was empty. Which it was. Elena was at work. The city was doing whatever cities do on Tuesday afternoons, and I was staring at my phone, waiting for something that was never going to come. Because Marco didn't contact people. People contacted Marco, and they did so carefully, with rehearsed words and an understanding that silence was probably the outcome they should hope for. Except he'd contacted me. Once, a text, at 2 a.m. on Sunday, "Don't wear that dress again." I'd stared at it for an hour, then deleted it. Then checked my deleted messages to make sure it was actually gone. Then spent Monday thinking about the fact that he apparently had my number. Had apparently been thinking about the gala enough at 2 a.m. to send me a message about my wardrobe choices. My apartment smelled like old coffee and the jasmine diffuser I'd bought trying to make the space feel less empty. The walls were a neutral beige that the landlord had agreed to, only if I promised to paint them back before I moved out. There were no photos on them. I'd learned that much from my time with Marco. Leaving no traces made it easier to disappear. My laptop was open on the kitchen table. I had 3 browser tabs open: a grocery delivery site I wasn't using, a job listing I wasn't qualified for, and a news article about some business dispute between rival families that had resulted in someone's restaurant burning down. I closed that last one quickly. I didn't need to know about Marco's world anymore. That was the deal I'd made with myself. The knock on the door happened so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I was on my feet before my brain caught up to the possibility that I shouldn't answer it. People didn't just show up at my apartment. People knew my address through careful, documented means. There were no coincidences in Marco's world. I looked through the peephole. He was standing in my hallway in jeans and a dark sweater, looking like he belonged in my apartment building about as much as a shark belonged in a bathtub. His hands were in his pockets. His expression was the kind of calm that meant he'd already calculated 17 different outcomes and had decided he could live with all of them. I didn't open the door. "Bella," he called through it, his voice carrying that specific tone that suggested he could say my name and have it be the last word anyone heard if he wanted. "Open the door. Go away." Not happening. I considered not opening the door. I considered calling the police, which would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic, calling the police on a man who probably had conversations with the police commissioner. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but he clearly knew I was. I opened the door. "You can't just show up at my apartment," I said, which was a stupid thing to say to someone who'd apparently just done exactly that. "I can." I did. He was looking past me into the apartment, assessing it the way he assessed everything, for threats, for exits, for whether it met some invisible standard he maintained. "Can I come in?" It wasn't a question, and never was with him. He was already moving, and I was already stepping aside because the alternative was a scene in my hallway that my neighbors would spend months discussing, and my landlord would definitely use as an excuse to raise my rent. He closed the door behind him with the kind of quiet decisiveness that made clear this was a boundary now. We were inside. The rules had changed. "I've been thinking about the gala," he said without preamble, still standing in my entryway like he'd materialized there, and wasn't quite sure how to proceed. "About you in that dress. I'm not having this conversation." I moved toward the kitchen, putting the small counter between us like it would help. It wouldn't. Nothing helped against Marco except time and distance, and I was managing neither successfully. "You said it wasn't your problem." I lied. He turned to look at me, and something in his face had shifted. Some crack in the perfect control that usually made him seem carved from stone. Or I was trying to. I'm not sure anymore which is which. The apartment felt very small. "Marco, there's someone who wants you dead," he said, cutting through whatever I was about to say with the casual efficiency of someone ripping off a bandage. "Or wants me to think they want you dead." The distinction is becoming difficult for me to maintain. I'd been reaching for a glass and my hand stilled, the rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 3 weeks convincing itself that Marco was a complication I'd escaped suddenly felt very far away. "That's not, I don't understand. That dress was a signal. The gala was public. You were visible." He moved into the living room, and I realized he was agitated. Actually agitated, the way I'd never seen him before. It was like you were daring someone to notice you, and someone did. So now, someone else has noticed them noticing, and now I'm here because I'm apparently incapable of not making your problems my own. "I didn't ask you to care about this." "No." He stopped, looking at me, and his eyes had that quality they got right before he did something destructive. "You asked me to leave. You asked me to let you go. You made it very clear that my world was dangerous and you didn't want any part of it. So I left. I stayed away. I let you pretend that you could just move forward. And now you're back because someone's threatening me? Now I'm back because I can't not be." He ran a hand through his hair, and it was such a human gesture, such an admission of frustration that I almost didn't recognize him. "Because I spent 3 weeks not thinking about you, and I did a very good job right up until you walked into a ballroom in red silk looking like a rebellion and destroyed 3 weeks of work. because some part of me, a part I've spent my entire adult life learning to suppress, has apparently decided that you matter more than my ability to function. I couldn't move. I was trapped between the kitchen counter and the weight of what he was saying, and it felt like standing too close to something that was about to explode. "This is why we can't do this," I said, and my voice sounded very far away. "This is why you were right to leave. Because now you're in my apartment and you're telling me that someone wants me dead, and you're framing it like it's my fault for wearing a dress. It's not your fault." He crossed the space between us, and I held myself very still, because my instinct was to touch him, and that seemed like the worst possible decision. "It's my fault for being unable to let you go, which means you're in danger because of me, which means I need to fix it." "By doing what?" He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were clenched at his sides like he was using every ounce of his control to keep them there. "By making it very clear to anyone who's paying attention," he said softly, "that you're off limits. By making sure that the cost of touching you is higher than anyone is willing to pay." "And how exactly do you plan to—" "By taking you with me." The words fell into the apartment like something heavy. "No. Do. Yes." He wasn't asking. His face had gone back to that marble calm, but his eyes had the intensity of obsession. "You're going to stay with me until this resolves. You're going to be in my house where I can protect you. You're going to make it clear to everyone watching that you're not a target. You're a choice. My choice. I'm not your property, Marco. No." He stepped closer, and I could smell him, the expensive cologne, and something darker underneath. Something that smelled like consequence. "But you are someone I've decided to keep safe, and I keep my commitments." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that this was exactly the problem, that this was the kind of thinking that had made me leave in the first place. But there was a part of Mia, part I'd been suppressing just as ruthlessly as he'd been suppressing his feelings, that felt relief flood through me like I'd been holding my breath for 3 weeks, and was finally allowed to exhale. "If I do this," I said slowly, "if I come with you, this doesn't mean we're back together. This is just protection." "Okay," he said, and the way he said it so smoothly made clear that he'd heard the lie in my words and had decided not to correct it. "Not yet, anyway. Pack what you need. You have 20 minutes. This is insane. Absolutely." He was already walking toward my bedroom, and I understood he was checking exits, assessing the space, making his own calculations about security. "But you wore red, Bella. You made it impossible for me to pretend I didn't love you. So now we deal with the consequences." I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the glasses I hadn't finished getting, and understood that I'd just made the same mistake twice, loved someone dangerous. Agreed to let him catch me. The only difference was this time I was doing it with my eyes open. His house wasn't a house. It was a statement made in stone and steel, positioned on the edge of the city, where it could see everything coming. The drive there had been silent, the kind of silence that pressed against my eardrums. He'd driven, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh. I'd watched the city blur past the window and tried not to think about the fact that I'd just moved in with Marco Russo because of a threat that might or might not be real, issued by a person I'd never met for reasons I didn't fully understand. The gates opened automatically when we approached. The driveway curved through landscaping that looked expensive and immaculate, and then the house all glass and modern angles, all terraces and floor-to-ceiling windows that probably retracted at his command. "It's not what I expected," I said, which was stupid. I didn't know what I expected. My brain had stopped forming coherent expectations the moment he'd appeared in my hallway. "What did you expect?" "Something darker. More mafia." He almost smiled. "This is the mafia, Kara. The darkness is just better organized here." The interior was minimalist in a way that made the space feel larger and colder than it should. Everything was whites and grays and blacks, punctuated by artworks that probably had names I wasn't sophisticated enough to know. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, and I understood that he could stand here and watch the world below like it was a chessboard, and he was the one moving the pieces. "Your room is upstairs," he said, and I realized with a small shock that I'd been standing in the entryway for several minutes, just staring. Third door on the left. There's a closet, a bathroom, whatever you need. And you, master suite is on the opposite end. We'll maintain some separation." His voice was carefully neutral. "There are staff members during the day, housekeeper, chef. I've told them you're a guest. You don't need to interact with them, but you can if you want." It all sounded very civilized, very separate, very much like a cage with excellent amenities. "What happens now?" I asked. "How long do I stay?" "Until the threat resolves." "And if it doesn't?" He looked at me, and there was something in his expression that suggested he'd already considered this possibility and had decided the answer was not one I was ready to hear. "It will," he said finally. My room was exactly what I would have expected if I'd been capable of expecting anything anymore. The bed was enormous, dressed in whites and grays. The closet was mostly empty. He'd apparently assumed I'd need to acquire a wardrobe. The bathroom had a rainfall shower head and products that smelled expensive and neutral. I sat on the bed and felt the weight of my own stupidity. I'd left him because his world was dangerous, because I couldn't sleep at night knowing that loving him meant eventually becoming a liability, a weakness that people would exploit. And now I was back in it, not because I decided to accept the danger, but because someone else had decided for me. Except there was a part of me that felt safe here, in this gray and white room, knowing that he was on the opposite side of the house. Because Marco's danger was specific. It was directed outward, at people who made the mistake of being a threat. It had never been directed at me, even when we were together. Even when I'd felt most terrified of loving him, I'd never been afraid of him. I was afraid of the cost of him. The cost of being loved by someone who solved problems with violence, who had conversations with people in alleys, whose phone sometimes rang at 3 a.m. and he'd get out of bed and disappear for hours. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," I called, expecting the housekeeper, expecting someone coming to introduce themselves or ask about my preferences or something that would make this feel slightly less like I'd been kidnapped and slightly more like I'd made a choice. Marco appeared instead, holding 2 cups of something that steamed gently. "Tea," he said, offering me one. "You always wanted tea before bed." I took it, and our fingers didn't touch, though he was clearly careful to make sure they didn't. Whatever separation he'd promised, he was being scrupulous about it. "Thank you," I said. He sat on the chair by the window, and there was something careful about the way he positioned himself. Not on the bed, not close enough to be threatening, but not so far away that I had to strain to hear him. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "so you understand why you're here. So you don't think I've done this out of obsession, even though I have." I waited. The tea was hot and tasted like chamomile and honey. "There's a family trying to move into the city," he continued. "The Corleones, not their real name, but it's easier. They're aggressive, efficient, and they like to take what doesn't belong to them. 3 weeks ago, they started asking questions about me. About my business, my operations, my personal interests. Why would they care about your personal interests? Because people like that understand leverage." He was looking out the window at the city below. "Because if they can identify something you care about, they can use it against you. And apparently they've identified you." My throat felt very tight. "How?" "The gala. You were seen with Elena, and Elena's boyfriend has connections to my operations, not direct, but close enough that someone paying attention would notice. And someone is always paying attention, so you're saying they want to hurt me to get to you." "I'm saying they're considering the possibility." He turned to look at me, and his eyes had that quality that suggested he was having to hold back several violent impulses. "And I'm saying that I'm not going to allow it. By locking me in your house. By making it clear to anyone who's paying attention that you're under my protection, that the cost of touching you is higher than they're willing to pay." "And what's the cost?" "Everything," he said quietly. "It would cost them everything." I set the tea down before I dropped it. "You can't mean that." "I do." He was very still, the way he got right before he did something terrible. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself that I could live without you, that we could be separate, that I could compartmentalize you into a memory and move forward. But the truth is, Bella, I'm not that strong. And now that you're here, now that you're safe, now that I can see you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. I'm not going to let you go again. This isn't love, Marco. This is possession. Maybe. He stood, and I understood he was leaving before he did something I wasn't ready for. But it's what you're going to get from me. He walked to the door, and I wanted to call him back, wanted to say something that would stop him, that would rewind us to 3 weeks ago when I'd been trying to move forward, when I'd been wearing red silk and pretending that the weight of loving him had finally lifted. Marco, he turned. Stay away from the windows, he said, and don't leave this room without telling me where you're going. The gates are locked, but I want to know your location at all times. So I am a prisoner. You're a person I love too much to lose. He said it like it was the simplest, most terrible thing in the world. The fact that it looks like a prison is just the architecture of my obsession. He left before I could respond, and I sat alone in the gray and white room and understood that I'd made a choice 3 weeks ago to leave him. But Marco had apparently decided that choice was no longer binding. The tea had gone cold. I drank it anyway because I was thirsty for something that would settle the trembling in my hands. 6 days later, the house had a specific rhythm. Marco left in the morning, sometimes early, sometimes after breakfast. I learned not to ask where. He came back in the evening, sometimes with blood under his fingernails that he washed away in the sink before I could pretend I hadn't seen it. I had a routine now. Wake up. Shower. The housekeeper, Maria, had started leaving breakfast in the kitchen. The chef came in the afternoons. I'd attempted reading, but the books on the shelves were all in Italian or Russian, and I'd found myself staring at the same sentence for 20 minutes without absorbing any meaning. On the 7th day, Marco came home early with a name. Dmitry Volkov, he said, setting a file on the marble table. He works for the Corleones. He's been watching your building, watching your work, building a profile. I didn't open the file. Just looking at the folder made me feel like I was being forced to participate in something violent. What does he want? Information, pressure, a way to get to me. Marco was still in his suit, jacket off, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before, not physically but emotionally, like he was carrying something too heavy. He's also sadistic. He likes to hurt people slowly. So the fact that he's interested in you is the worst possible news. Thank you for that reassurance, I said quietly. He looked at me, and something in his face softened. Come here, he said. No. Bella, please. I stood. I'd learned to recognize when Marco's requests were actually demands, and this had the inflection of a demand. He was sitting on the couch, and when I stood in front of him, he pulled me down, not forcefully, but with enough certainty that I ended up sitting next to him. His arm came around my shoulders. It was the first time he'd touched me since I'd arrived. I know this is suffocating, he said into my hair. I know you feel like you're trapped, but I need you to understand that this is the only way I know how to keep you alive. By locking me in your house. By making sure you're not accessible. His fingers traced a slow line down my arm. By being the biggest threat in the room, which means anyone considering hurting you has to calculate whether the cost is worth it. It is. It's worth it to me. The cost to them is not. And what if they decide it is? Then I killed them. He said it the way someone else might say they'd go to the store. Matter of fact. Inevitable. And I keep killing anyone they send until they stop trying. I should have been horrified. I should have pulled away. Instead, I leaned into him, and he made a small sound like relief. This can't be the rest of my life, I said. No. His arm tightened around me. But it might be the next few weeks or months, until Dmitry decides the cost is too high. Or he comes for me. He won't. You sound very certain. I am. He pulled back far enough to look at me. His eyes had that intensity they got when he was about to do something irrevocable. Because I'm going to make sure the cost of trying is so high that it would destroy them, not just financially, personally, operationally. I'm going to dismantle them so thoroughly that Dmitry won't have anywhere left to hide. I should have felt reassured. Instead, I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean? It means I'm going to be very busy for a while. It means you're going to stay here, and you're not going to leave this house for anything. It means if anyone tries to contact you, you tell me immediately. And in the meantime?" He was quiet for a long moment. His hand was still on my arm, his thumb moving in slow circles. "In the meantime, you stay with me," he said finally, "and we try to pretend that the world isn't burning around us." He left that evening, stayed through dinner, stayed through my attempt at conversation that he mostly answered in monosyllables, and then left at 9 p.m. with the kind of finality that suggested he wouldn't be back until late. I found myself standing at the window of his office, staring out at the city, and understanding with sudden clarity that loving Marco meant accepting that some part of him would always belong to a world I couldn't follow. I could be protected from it, kept safe behind his money and his reputation and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened me. But I couldn't escape it. The file was still on the marble table. I opened it. Dmitry Volkov had pale eyes and a scar that split his left cheekbone, and the kind of smile in his photograph that suggested he'd done terrible things and would do them again. The dossier had information about him, his affiliations, his methods, his history of violence. And a note, at the bottom, in what I assumed was Marco's handwriting: "Do not contact. Do not approach. Risk assessment, extreme." I closed the file and felt my hands shaking. This was the cost of Marco's love. This was what it meant to be loved by someone who solved problems with violence and consequence. It meant that there would be a Dmitry Volkov, and then another threat, and then another, and they would keep coming, because that was the price of being important to someone important in the wrong kind of way. When Marco came home at 2 a.m., smelling like the city, and something darker, I was still in his office. He found me there without saying anything, just looked at the open file in my face and understood what I'd done. "I told you not to. I know what you said." I stood. My voice sounded very small. "I want to know what happens now." He closed the file, tucking it away, and when he looked at me, his expression was shuttered in a way that meant he was protecting me from something. "Now," he said, "I handle it." 10 days in the house had become a kind of purgatory, not uncomfortable exactly, but suspended. Marco came and went. I occupied the gray and white room and the living spaces between. We existed in the same space, but at a careful distance, a distance he'd apparently decided was necessary. He'd established rules. No phone calls except to Elena, and only supervised. No going near the windows after dark. No leaving the house. In exchange, I got access to his library, his kitchen, his chef's attempts to feed me dishes I only partially understood. On the 10th day, he found me in the library surrounded by Italian cookbooks I couldn't read. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Learning Italian," I said, which was a lie. "I'm terrible at it. Come on." He was already moving toward the kitchen. "I'll teach you." The Italian lesson turned into Marco making risotto while explaining the difference between risotto and pasta, while I stood next to him and tried not to notice the way his hands moved, precise and controlled, even doing something as simple as stirring rice. "Your grandmother taught you this," I said. It wasn't a question. My nah, yes. He didn't look at me. She had opinions about food. She said that feeding someone was the most honest conversation you could have with them. "Is that what this is?" He stirred the risotto, added wine that hissed against the hot rice, and finally turned to look at me. "This is me trying not to touch you," he said quietly. "Because if I start, I'm not going to stop." My breath caught. I should have stepped back, should have reminded him of his own rules about distance and propriety. Instead, I stepped closer. "Why?" "Because you're here, and you're mine, and I've been holding on to control by a thread for 10 days, and I'm not sure how much longer I can maintain it." He set down the wooden spoon. "Because every time you breathe, I'm aware of it. Every time you look at me, I'm calculating whether you're ready. Every time you're in the same room, I'm calculating the cost of letting you leave, and it keeps getting higher." "You keep saying I'm yours," I said, "like I'm something you own. You're not." He turned fully toward me, and his proximity was suddenly very real, very present. "But I'm yours, completely, which is worse for me than the other way around." I was trembling. I could feel it in my hands, in the space between us, in the air itself. "Marco, I'm not going to touch you," he said, and the effort it cost him was visible in the way his jaw tightened. "Unless you ask." "I can't ask. I know." He turned back to the risotto, which is why we're standing here having this conversation instead of doing something we're both thinking about. The risotto was perfect, creamy and rich and dotted with peas and parmesan that Marco grated over the top with a knife. We ate it at the counter, and the silence between us had weight, presence, consequence. "Tell me about before," I said, because I needed to talk about something other than the fact that I wanted to touch him and couldn't seem to form the words to ask. "Before what?" "Before me. Before you decided that love was something you could do." He was quiet for a long time, his fork moving through the risotto without him seeming to notice what he was eating. "There was a woman," he said finally. "When I was younger, I thought I loved her. I was sure I did. And then I realized I loved the idea of her more than I loved her. And by then, it was too late. She was already involved in my world, and it destroyed her." "What happened to her?" "She left." He set down his fork. "She married someone else. Someone safe. I heard she has children now, a normal life. Sometimes I look her up, make sure she's still safe, make sure no one I know has leverage over her. But I don't contact her. That would be cruel." "Is that what you're afraid of?" I asked. "That this will destroy me?" "I know it will." He turned to face me. "The question is whether the destruction I cause is worth the time we have. And for me, the answer is yes, because I'm selfish and broken, and I can't seem to live without you." I set down my fork too. "I'm scared," I said. "I know. Not of Dimitri, not of the danger. I know. I'm scared that I'm going to stay here. And I'm going to let you convince me that this is love, that this is acceptable, that being protected means being trapped, and I'm scared that you're going to let me, because it's easier than letting me go." He reached out and touched my face, his hand careful against my cheek, his thumb tracing my cheekbone. "I'm not going to let you go," he said, "but I'm also not going to convince you that this is love. I'm going to show you that it is." "How?" Instead of answering, he leaned in, and I thought he was going to kiss me, and my heart was suddenly racing, and my hands were reaching for him, and then he pulled away. "Not yet," he said quietly. "When you're ready, when you ask." 14 days in, I made the mistake on a Tuesday. It was a small mistake, the kind that seemed insignificant until it wasn't. Elena had called while I was alone, had called 3 times, and I'd answered on the 4th call because I missed her voice, and I needed to hear that there was a world outside this gray and white cage. "Sarah, where the hell have you been?" She was frantic, her voice tight with worry. "You just disappeared, and I've been calling you constantly, and Marco's people told me you were fine, but..." "I'm fine," I said, which was a lie in approximately 17 different ways. "You don't sound fine. You sound like someone who's made a terrible decision and is realizing it too late." "He's protecting me," I said. "There's someone. I don't care if the president is after you. You don't disappear into Marco Russo's house and pretend that's normal." Her voice cracked. "I've been researching him, Sarah. Do you know what he does? Do you know what his business actually is?" I did know, or I knew enough. I didn't ask for specifics. "I know who he is." "Then you know this isn't going to end well. These people don't have relationships, they have acquisitions. That's not fair. It's fair and it's true, and you're making the same mistake twice." She was crying now. "Please tell me where you are. Please let me help you leave." "I can't leave." "Of course you can. You can always leave. You're choosing not to, and I'm trying to understand why, because the Sarah I know would never." Marco appeared in the doorway, and Elena's voice died the moment I saw his expression. "Hang up," he said quietly. I hung up. He didn't seem angry, which was somehow worse than if he had been. He took the phone from my hand, and his touch was careful, but I could feel the tension underneath the gentleness. "Who was that?" "Elena." "And you told her where you are?" "No, she was worried. She was asking questions." "Did you tell her about the situation?" Only that you were protecting me." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was level in a way that suggested he was having to hold back several violent impulses. "You just told someone outside my organization that you're here, that you're under protection, that there's a threat significant enough to warrant it." He set the phone on the counter. "Do you understand what you've just done? I talked to my best friend. You've just created a liability." His jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "Elena is now a target. Anyone interested in leverage now knows that she's someone you care about. Anyone interested in pressure now knows exactly how to apply it." I felt my chest tighten. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't." He turned away from me, and I could see him calculating, assessing, determining damage control. "I need to make some calls. Marco, I'm sorry, I didn't. I know you didn't." He was already pulling out his phone, which is the only reason I'm not furious with you instead of simply very, very concerned. He left the kitchen, and I stood alone with the weight of my mistake pressing down on my shoulders. I'd been so focused on my own discomfort with being trapped that I hadn't considered the possibility that staying in contact with the outside world might endanger the people I cared about. He came back an hour later and found me on the couch trying to read something I wasn't processing. "Elena's fine," he said without preamble. "She's been assigned someone. Someone will stay close to her until this resolves. She won't know about it, but he'll be there. You're having her followed. I'm keeping her alive." He sat down, and he suddenly looked very tired. "Because you care about her, and I can't have you making sacrifices that I then have to reverse. This isn't fair to her." "No." He didn't argue. "But it's the cost of your mistake." "The cost of my mistake?" I stood. "The cost of you locking me in your house? The cost of you deciding what's best for me without asking?" "You don't get to be righteous about this," he said. And there was an edge to his voice now. "You don't get to act like I'm the villain here when you're the one who disregarded the rules I put in place to keep you alive." "I didn't disregard anything. I talked to my best friend, and in doing so, you made her a target." He stood too. "Do you understand that? You made her vulnerable because you needed her validation, that you'd made a terrible decision getting involved with me." "That's not what I was doing." "Wasn't it?" He was closer now, and his proximity had an edge to it. All the careful distance he'd maintained suddenly burned away. "You needed to hear her tell you that you'd made a mistake, that this was wrong, that you should leave, and you were willing to endanger her to get that reassurance. I was willing to talk to my best friend. You were willing to break the rules I put in place to keep you safe." I was shaking with anger and shame and the awful certainty that he was partly right. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Do I get punished?" Something flashed across his face, something dark and hungry and very dangerous. He stepped closer, and I realized what I'd said, what I'd offered up, and I didn't pull away. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't ask me to punish you." He was very close now, and his eyes were black and focused entirely on me. "Because I will, and it won't be the kind of punishment that's supposed to teach a lesson. It will be the kind that I use to prove that you're mine, and once I start proving it, I'm not going to stop." I couldn't breathe. The air between us had become thick and charged and full of consequence. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did." He reached out and touched my face, his thumb brushing my cheekbone, and I realized he was shaking too. "You meant it very carefully. You meant it knowing what you were offering, and you're tempting me to take it." "Then take it," I whispered. He pulled away like I'd burned him. "Not like this," he said, and his voice was rough. "Not when you're angry and frightened and looking to punish yourself for caring about someone. If I touch you, it's not going to be because you asked out of spite." He left the room, and I heard the sound of his car starting, the gates opening, him leaving to go somewhere and do something I wasn't going to ask about. I sat alone on the couch and understood that I'd just made another mistake. But this one had been intentional. 17 days in, he came back at dawn, smelling like violence and cologne. And I was waiting for him in the kitchen like I'd been there all night. Which I had. He looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. Surprise, maybe. or the resignation of someone who'd been fighting a war he was never going to win. "Go to bed," he said. "No." "Bella, I want to talk about what happened," I said. "I want to apologize properly." "You already have. I want to do more than that." My voice was shaking. "I want to understand what you meant when you said you'd prove that I'm yours. I want to understand what that looks like." He set down the keys, and in the quiet of the kitchen, I could hear the sound of his breathing, measured and careful. "That's not a conversation we should have right now," he said. "Why not?" "Because I'm exhausted, and I'm covered in other people's blood, and I'm 1 second away from putting you against that wall and showing you exactly what happens when you offer yourself to me." I should have been terrified. I should have excused myself, retreated to the gray and white room, maintained some kind of dignity. Instead, I moved closer. "Maybe I want to know what happens," I said. He was very still. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I think I do." "You don't." He turned away from me, moving toward the sink, turning on the water, washing his hands like he was washing away the night. "What you're asking for is simple. What I want is complicated and destructive, and it doesn't end the way fairy tales end." "I don't want a fairy tale," I said to his back. "I never did. I just want you to stop pretending you're protecting me when what you're really doing is keeping me." He turned off the water and looked at me, and his eyes had that quality they got right before he did something irrevocable. "Come here," he said. I went to him, and he took my face in his hands still wet from the sink, cold against my skin, and he kissed me the way he did everything else, completely, irrevocably, like he was making a decision that would reshape the world. I kissed him back, and it felt like surrender. His hands moved to my shoulders, and he pulled me closer, and I understood that every day of distance, every careful boundary he maintained, had been leading to this moment. When he pulled away, we were both breathing hard. "Upstairs," he said. I should have hesitated. Should have asked questions or made requests or established some kind of negotiation. Instead, I took his hand, and he led me up the stairs to his room, to the bed I'd never seen before. And he closed the door like he was closing off the rest of the world. The room was dark, lit only by the early morning light filtering through curtains I couldn't quite focus on. He was still covered in the night, in things I didn't ask about. And he didn't try to hide it from me. He just looked at me like I was the most important thing he'd ever seen, like I was worth every terrible choice he'd made. "Tell me to stop," he said, "and I will." I didn't tell him to stop. He kissed me again, and his hands moved to the hem of the shirt I was wearing, and he looked at me like he was asking permission without using words. I nodded, and he lifted the shirt over my head. And then my hands were reaching for him, fumbling with buttons, desperate to feel him the way he was feeling me. "Slow," he whispered against my shoulder. "We have time," but we didn't. We had this moment, this stolen piece of morning before the world started again, before the threat reasserted itself, before we had to remember that I was supposed to be scared of him. He laid me down on the bed, and his hands were gentle in ways his voice had never been, his touch careful and considerate in ways that made it clear that control, true control, was knowing how to soften, not how to break. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he was memorizing me. Like every touch was a conversation he'd been wanting to have. I was trembling, but not from fear. My hands found his shoulders, his back, the places where his muscles met bone, and I was desperate to know him the way he knew me. When I reached for him, he caught my wrist gently, kissed my palm. "Not yet," he said. "Let me." And I did. I let him. I surrendered to the weight of his body, the precision of his touch, the way he whispered my name like it was the only word that mattered. And when the moment came where I couldn't take anymore, where I needed him completely, he was there. And it felt less like possession and more like finally understanding what it meant to be known by someone completely. It didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home. Afterward, we lay in the dark, and his hand was on my chest, over my heart, like he was checking that I was still there, that I hadn't dissolved into something abstract. "I love you," he said into my hair. "I'm going to keep telling you that until you believe me." I didn't say it back. I was too overwhelmed, too confused by the fact that I'd just given him every single part of myself, and it felt less like losing control and more like finally finding it. "You're mine now," he said quietly. I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some kind of independence, some boundary that proved I was still my own person. Instead, I turned in his arms and looked at him in the gray light of dawn, and I whispered back, "You're mine too." 23 days in. Everything changed after that morning, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't know it would. I moved into his room, or he moved into mine, and the distinctions stopped mattering. We existed in a kind of suspended reality where the world outside was dangerous and uncertain, and we were very carefully not thinking about it. Except Marco had to think about it. The phone calls increased. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him on the terrace, speaking in Italian to someone I didn't know, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that involved violence I couldn't quantify. He'd come back to bed and hold me like I was something fragile that might break. On the 23rd day, everything broke instead. The news came from Maria, the housekeeper, who appeared in the kitchen while I was making coffee with an expression that suggested she was delivering a death sentence. "There's been an incident," she said carefully, "in the city." I didn't ask what incident. I knew what incident. The same incident that would make Marco's phone start ringing, that would pull him away from me, that would remind us both that we existed in a borrowed moment. He called at 11 a.m. "I need you to pack a bag," he said. No preamble, all business. "I'm sending someone for you. You're going to a property I own in the countryside. You're going to stay there, and you're not going to leave until I call you." What happened? Dimitri made a move. "Nothing you need to worry about. Don't lie to me." There was silence on the other end. "He went after Elena," Marco said finally. "He took her. I have people working on her location now." My entire body went cold. She's alive. She's being held as leverage against me, which means I need to be strategic, and I can't do that while I'm worried about where you are. "Then I'm coming with you." "No." "Yes, you can't. I can't just sit in the countryside while Elena is. You're not sitting anywhere while Elena is anything." His voice was hard. "You're doing what I'm telling you to do because the alternative is that I spend my energy protecting both of you, and that dilutes my effectiveness. So you're sending me away? I'm keeping you safe. You're keeping me contained." I could feel the anger rising in my chest, the fear, the awful certainty that this was always how it would be. I can't just disappear while someone I love is being tortured. "You think I like this?" His voice cracked, and the anger drained out of it. "You think I want to send you away? You think I don't want you here while I handle this? Then don't. I have to." He was breathing hard. "Because if I don't, if you stay here, then he has two targets, and I can't protect you both. I can only protect one of you, and that's you. Always you. What about Elena? I'm going to get her back." "How?" He didn't answer, which meant he didn't have an answer, which meant he was going to do something terrible. "Marco, someone will be there in an hour. Pack what you need." He hung up. I stood in the kitchen and understood that this was the cost of loving him. This was the consequence of surrendering completely to someone whose world was built on consequences. My best friend was being used as leverage, and the man I loved was going to do something violent to get her back, and I was going to be sent away like something fragile that needed to be protected from the world. I didn't pack. Instead, I went to his office, to the locked drawer in his desk that he didn't know I knew about, and I found the address. The address of the warehouse where Dimitri had taken her, the address that he'd been careful to keep away from me. The information he'd been careful to keep secret. The car appeared at 1 p.m. I was ready, with a bag, but I wasn't going to the countryside. I was going to the warehouse, and I was going to save Elena myself, because Marco's way of saving people was violence, and maybe there was a smarter way. "Ready, Miss Sarah?" the driver asked. Yes, I lied, and he didn't see the address I'd written down and tucked into my pocket, didn't see the knife I'd taken from the kitchen, didn't see the desperation in my hands. The same evening, the warehouse smelled like rust and things rotting in corners that hadn't seen daylight. I hadn't thought through what came after getting the address, I hadn't considered what I would do when I actually arrived at a place where dangerous people were holding my best friend. I just followed the GPS in a cab I'd paid cash for, given the driver an address 1 block away, and then walked the rest. The security was minimal, they weren't expecting anyone to be stupid enough to come alone. The door was locked, but the window beside it wasn't, and I'd read enough crime novels to know that windows could be broken, that the noise would matter less than the access. I was wrong about that. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot, and by the time I'd pulled myself through the window frame, I could hear people moving in the darkness above. "Hello?" Elena's voice, terrified and small, and coming from somewhere deeper in the structure. I was moving before I'd fully assessed the situation, because that's what happens when you're desperate. Logic surrenders to instinct, and instinct says, run toward the person you love. I found her in a room on the 2nd floor, zip-tied to a chair, her face swollen on one side, blood dried in her hair. "Sarah?" She sounded like she was dreaming. "What are you doing here?" "Getting you out." I was reaching for the zip ties when I felt the gun barrel against my back. "That's very stupid," a voice said in accented English. Dimitri. I'd never met him, but I knew his voice from Marco describing it, from the way fear had changed my understanding of sound. The boss sends his girl away, and the girl comes back. Very romantic, very tragic. I didn't turn around. "Let her go," I said. "I'm the one you want leverage on." "Am I?" He laughed, and it was a sound without any humanity in it. "No, I want leverage on him. And you are excellent leverage. Much better now that you've come to me willingly. Thank you for saving me the trouble of hunting you down." He was going to kill me. I understood that with sudden clarity. He was going to kill me, and he was probably going to make Marco watch, and that was the entire point. This wasn't about money or territory. This was about breaking Marco the way Marco had apparently broken some part of Dimitri's operation. I took a step forward toward Elena, and that's when the lights went out. Complete darkness. No gradual dimming, no transition, just absolute absence of light. Dimitri screamed something in Russian, and I heard the sound of gunshots, the sound of people running, the sound of organized chaos that suggested Marco had been waiting for exactly this moment. I moved toward Elena, found her, started working at the zip ties with the knife I still had in my pocket. She was crying, whispering prayers, and I was telling her it was okay while my hands shook so badly I could barely see, except I couldn't see anything. The darkness was complete. "Sarah." Marco's voice finding me in the black like a light. "I'm here. Elena. I have her. Come to my voice." I left the knife and moved toward him, and his hands found me in the dark, pulled me into his chest, and he was moving me away from the chaos, away from the violence, toward an exit I couldn't see but apparently existed. The light came back in fragments, a door opening, the city lights, the sound of sirens already converging. I could see Marco's face, his eyes focused and cold, his body positioning itself between me and the warehouse like he could shield me from the memory of what he was about to do. Behind us, Dimitri was screaming. "Get in the car," Marco said, and there was no ask in his tone, no negotiation. I got in the car, and Elena was there, actually there, alive and bleeding and crying, and I pulled her into my arms while Marco drove us away from the warehouse toward somewhere safe. He dropped us at a private hospital, somewhere clean and discreet and completely off the books. He told the doctor something quietly, and the doctor nodded, and Elena was being tended to, and I was being examined for injuries I didn't remember acquiring. And then he took me into a private room and closed the door. "Don't ever do that again," he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that suggested he was holding back significant violence. "Do you understand me? Don't ever, ever put yourself in danger like that." Elena was alive because I was already mobilizing to get her. He was pacing now, and his hands were clenched into fists. "Alive because I have contingencies for contingencies. You didn't save her. You made my job harder. You put yourself in a position where I almost had to choose between you. I had to do something. You had to trust me. I do trust you. I just also needed to help her." He stopped pacing and looked at me, and I could see the violence underneath his skin. The control it was taking to not put his fist through something, You almost died, he said. Do you understand that? You almost died, and if you died, I would have killed everyone in that warehouse. I would have burned it down. I would have destroyed the Corleones and anyone connected to them, and it would have cost me everything I've built. So what? I'm supposed to just accept that I'm helpless? You're supposed to accept that you're not responsible for saving people. You're supposed to accept that sometimes the person who loves you is the one who handles the danger. He moved closer, and his hands came up like he wanted to touch me but was afraid of what would happen if he did. You're supposed to accept that loving me means accepting that I have to be the one who does the terrible things. I can't live like that. Yes, you can. He cupped my face, and his hands were shaking. Because you have no other choice. Because I'm not letting you go. Because the moment you tried to play hero in that warehouse, you proved that you're willing to die for people you love, and I can't have that. So you accept my terms, or you accept that I will keep you so protected that you never have the opportunity to make a stupid decision again. I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some kind of agency, some boundary that proved I was still my own person. But I'd just broken into a warehouse, I'd just almost died. I'd just proven that the moment someone I loved was in danger, I would make terrible decisions. I'm sorry, I said. Don't apologize. He pulled me into his chest. Just promise me you'll never do that again. I promise. He held me like I might disappear, and in the distance I could hear Elena being treated, being saved, being brought back to a world she'd almost left. The cost of loving Marco was everything, and I was still paying it. 6 weeks later, Elena's injuries had healed faster than her emotional ones. The physical wounds, the broken ribs, the lacerations, the concussion, those resolved in a matter of weeks. The trauma took longer. I'd been with her through the nightmares, the panic attacks, the awful moments at 3 a.m. when she'd remember that she'd been minutes away from becoming a casualty of someone else's war. She didn't blame me. I'd expected her to, but she didn't. Instead, she seemed to understand that loving Marco meant accepting that the people around me would occasionally end up collateral damage. The warehouse was never mentioned again. Dimitri disappeared. I learned not to ask what happened. Learned that some details were better left as mysteries I could pretend didn't exist. The Corleone family apparently decided that the cost of targeting Marco was higher than they'd anticipated. They stopped asking questions. They stopped sending threats. They became irrelevant. I moved fully into Marco's room, then moved in completely when he renovated the entire east wing of the house, painted the walls the color of storm clouds, filled the closets with clothes he'd apparently bought in secret, made the space ours in a way that the rest of the house never quite was. We established a rhythm. He still left in the mornings, still came home sometimes with blood under his fingernails. But the violence had become abstract again, something that happened in the world but didn't touch the bubble we'd created in the gray and white house. On the 6-week mark, he took me to dinner. It wasn't fancy, not the kind of place where people dressed in designer clothes and spoke in coded language. It was a small restaurant in the old part of the city, the kind of place where the owner knew him, where the waiters moved carefully around his table, where we could sit in a corner and exist somewhat outside the normal rules of society. I want to ask you something, he said, and his hands were careful on the table, not touching me but close. And I want you to answer honestly. Okay, I said, and my heart was suddenly racing because I knew what was coming, and I'd been preparing for this conversation for weeks, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready. Do you want to leave? He asked. Truly. Not because you think you should, not because you feel obligated, but do you actually want to go? I set down my fork. No, I said, I don't. Even knowing what I am, even knowing that loving me means accepting danger, accepting violence, accepting that the world I live in will occasionally touch the people you care about, even knowing all of that. I reached across the table and he met me halfway, his fingers finding mine, because you're the one thing that makes sense anymore. Because being with you feels less like a cage and more like I finally found the place I was supposed to be. He turned his hand over, and I realized he was holding something, a small velvet box that definitely wasn't there a moment ago. Then marry me, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of intention, a declaration of future that didn't require my consent to proceed. Marry me and make this permanent. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life protecting you, which apparently means letting you into my world completely because you're too stubborn to stay on the periphery. I should have hesitated, should have asked for time, for space, for any of the things that people who are making serious decisions ask for. Instead, I was already saying yes, and he was already sliding the ring on my finger, simple, elegant, expensive in the way that everything in his life was. I want to take you somewhere, he said, after we eat. Is that okay? I nodded, and he took me to a place I'd never been before, a penthouse at the top of a building that overlooked the entire city. The walls were all glass, and the lights of the city spread out below us like stars that had fallen to earth and decided to glow from the ground instead. This is ours, he said. If you want it, a place that's not a cage, a place that's just ours. I looked at the city, at the life we'd somehow built despite the impossibility of it, and I understood that love, real love, wasn't the fairy tale kind. It was dangerous and messy, and sometimes it broke you into pieces that you had to reassemble differently. But it was real. I want it, I said. I want this. I want you. He turned me toward him, and he kissed me like he was making another promise, another vow, another commitment to being the person who caught me when I fell. You're mine, he said, and it was the second time he'd said it, and this time it didn't feel like possession. It felt like relief. The wedding happened in the spring, in a garden that Marco had apparently bought specifically for the ceremony. There were maybe 50 people, family, business associates disguised as friends, Elena in a dress that almost made her look like she'd never seen the inside of a warehouse. I wore white, which felt like a lie. But Marco wanted me to, and I'd learned that when Marco wanted something, the smartest thing was to let him have it and make peace with it later. The vows were simple. No promises about happy endings or forever. We both knew better than that. Just promises to be honest, to keep fighting, to accept that love meant accepting the worst parts of each other and deciding they were worth it anyway. 3 months into marriage, I found him in the penthouse office, looking at files on the desk, and I understood without asking that there was another threat, another situation that required his attention. But he closed the files when I walked in, like I was more important than the danger, like I'd learned to be more important to him than the business. He pulled me into his lap. I love you, he said. I know I don't say it often, but I need you to know that every decision I make with you in mind. Every risk I calculate, I'm thinking about whether it leaves you alone. I know, I said. I love you too. It wasn't the end of the story. There would be more threats, more dangerous moments, more decisions that would haunt me at 3 a.m. But there would also be mornings like this, where he held me like I was the most important thing in the world, where the danger felt distant, where the love felt real and true and absolutely worth the cost. I'd asked him once what his greatest weakness was. He'd said, you, and I'd expected that to terrify me. Instead, it felt like coming home,